When Congress returns after the elections on Tuesday, it'll face one of the most hotly debated issues in the campaign, raising taxes on the rich. That's President Obama's position, to keep the Bush tax cuts in place except for those on the wealthiest 2% as a way to reduce the dreaded deficit. It's an idea already percolating among the governors. 8 states have increased so-called millionaire income taxes so far as a way of avoiding drastic budget cuts on health and education. And on Tuesday, voters could make Washington state the 9th. But with our national debt in the trillions, budget experts will tell you that just taxing the rich isn't enough. One Republican brave enough to go public is David Stockman, President Reagan's budget director. He says all the Bush tax cuts should be eliminated, even those on the middle class. And he says his own Republican Party has gone too far with its anti-tax religion. Tax cutting is a religion. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's become, in the sense, an absolute, something that can't be questioned, something that's gospel, something that's sort of embedded in the catechism. And so scratch the average Republican today, and he'll say tax cuts, tax cuts, tax cuts.
Cut taxes.
Cutting taxes.
Make the tax cuts permanent.
It's rank demagoguery. We should call it for what it is. If these people were all put into a room on penalty of death to come up with how much they could cut, they couldn't come up with $50 billion when the problem is $1.3 trillion. So to stand before the public and rub raw this anti-tax sentiment, the Republican Party, as much as it pains me to say this, should be ashamed of themselves.
This from Ronald Reagan's old budget director? Architect of the largest tax cut in American history? But he doesn't let the Democrats off the hook. He says he cringes when he hears the president say things like this.
Now, I believe we ought to make the tax cuts for the middle class permanent.
We have now got both parties essentially telling a big lie with a capital B and a capital L to the public. And that is that we can have all this government, 24% of GDP, this huge entitlement program, all of the bailouts, and yet we don't have to tax ourselves and pay our bills. That's delusional.
Why isn't this statement correct? We cannot really deal with the deficit until we get our recovery underway.
The recovery has already happened. It is weak. It is tepid
How
creation.
can you say the recovery has happened when we have 10% unemployment?
The unemployment rate is not going to drop by any material amount anytime soon. And we're going to be in a period of austerity. We've had a 30-year spree of really phony prosperity in this country.
Now our national debt is growing by $100 billion a month. For those who say cutting spending is the answer, Stockman says both parties have thrown in the towel on that.
Finally, even the Republicans have said there's nothing significant we want to cut. They don't want to cut Social Security entitlements. They don't want to cut Medicare reimbursement to doctors, farm subsidies, education loans for middle-class students, certainly not defense.
Many of the states are in the same boat, facing huge deficits with few prospects for cutting, which is why Washington state is joining the movement across the country to tax the rich.
Hey, everybody.
On Tuesday, voters will decide on Initiative 1098 that would create an income tax, but only on the wealthy, of whom there are many. 133,000 millionaires and 7 billionaires, including Bill Gates of Microsoft.
Thank you.
His father, Bill Gates Sr., has poured his own money into backing Initiative 1098.
Some people say Initiative 1098 is about soaking the rich.
The tax would bring in $3 billion a year to be spent mainly on education, which has suffered cutbacks as the state reels under a massive deficit.
Vote yes on 1098. It's good for Washington.
Washington is one of only 7 states without any income tax. The proposal would create a 5% rate on income over $200,000 for individuals and $400,000 for couples. A 9% rate kicks in at $500,000 on individuals and $1 million for couples. Let's say a couple earns $500,000.
Okay.
How much do you think they'll have to pay?
Well, they would pay $5,000 because that's 5% of the $100,000 on which they would pay.
Oh, they'd only pay on the 100,000. They're exempt up to the 400,000.
Precisely.
So they'd only pay on 100,000.
Precisely.
Well, it's not very much
Precisely.
if you earn that kind of money.
Precisely.
His son Bill is on his side, along with the public employees unions. The other side is a who's who of the state's big businesses: Boeing, Amazon, and even Microsoft. Bill Gates is still chairman, but the CEO, Steve Ballmer, opposes the initiative, which is why they're calling this the Battle of the Billionaires. Is it awkward?
Now, the word awkward fits, yes.
Ballmer's side argues that the Soak the Rich tax would stifle high-tech innovation and lead to businesses moving out of the state. We asked Microsoft, Amazon, and Boeing for interviews, but they all declined. Businesses are saying they'll leave.
Yes. The real truth of the matter is that the people that own businesses are the people who will be paying the tax, and my analysis is they don't want to pay the tax.
The rich guys don't want to.
The rich guys don't want to pay the tax.
Are you saying you just think they're greedy?
No, because it is. No, they're defensive. I guess you could call it greed, I suppose, wanting to not write another check, sure.
Steve Ballmer?
Yeah.
He's worth $14 billion. You don't think...
He's a very fine guy, too. The fact of the matter is there are 43 states in this country that have a state income tax. And in those states, the Microsofts or the ABCs, whatever, have not fled the state. I mean, it's just a gross exaggeration.
But entrepreneur Brian Mistley begs to disagree.
This initiative really is a nail in the coffin of small businesses and startups in our state. It really impacts the tech community very heavily.
Nail in the coffin? You mean kill it off?
That's correct.
Mistley is the CEO of INRIX, a software company that monitors traffic around the world and provides data for GPS systems and sites like MapQuest.
So this is a map of Paris.
He says businesses would leave the state, especially high-tech companies like his that deal in data and aren't tied down by factories or assembly lines. He'd consider moving some of his 60 employees to other states where he has offices. What are the states?
Massachusetts, Florida, California.
Massachusetts, income tax. Go ahead. California, income tax.
Texas, Florida, Michigan, Colorado.
Okay, 4 out of the 6 have income taxes. I mean, I've heard a lot of businessmen say what you're saying, and I keep wondering, well, where are they going to move if they leave?
Well, each state has its own competitive advantages. So by adding this additional burden, it makes us much less attractive.
Adam Stites is another entrepreneur who opposes the initiative. 5 years ago, he moved his company, iStores, from Portland, Oregon, across the Columbia River, to Vancouver, Washington, just 9 miles away.
It broke down to taxes. Oregon has the highest income tax in the United States, and Washington has the lowest at 0%.
iStores is the largest online retailer of paintball equipment. Stites has been hiring staff for a new company he acquired that sells prank novelties.
Is for Halloween?
It is for Halloween or for any times that you need to be a man-eating shark.
Under the new tax, he would have to pay $50,000 a year, and that, he says, would hamper his ability to expand any further. This money, if it passes, will go specifically to education, because they've been cutting schools and things like that. So what is Washington State supposed to do about its schools in terms of revenue?
I think that the state in aggregate needs to take a look at its expenses.
Like?
I've had opportunity in Portland to see cars being washed by third-party washing firms cleaning cars on the weekends for state vehicles. I don't have someone who comes that cleans my car in a van and waxes and washes it. It's in Portland, but I think it's indicative of government spending.
But the state budget has already been cut by $5 billion, and the governor, Christine Gregoire, says they're at the bone.
To cut people off hospice, I think, is immoral. To cut children off health care, to cut their education so they don't have a chance at a decent future, I think that would result in an immoral budget.
She says she doesn't understand why so many of the state's high-tech CEOs, who are always complaining about the woeful state of American education, are so opposed to paying this tax for schools. These businesses that want the educated workforce, they're against this. What do they say to you when you challenge them on this?
I tell them, I have the utmost respect for them. These are great CEOs. And I say to them, here's the problem. You always want us to invest more in education, and now you say no. So my question to you, if not this, then what? Don't just tell
what do
me
they
no.
say? What do they say?
They don't have an answer, Lesley.
The initiative was way ahead in the polls until the opposition started airing ads saying 1098 is a slippery slope.
And can be extended to you in just 2 years.
Polls now show the middle class thinks they too will be hit with income taxes. And the high-tech entrepreneurs we met say there's a fairness issue. Bill Gates got to start Microsoft without an income tax. And this is something you hear a lot, that they find it curious Gates is supporting an income tax now.
I believe the Gateses have already made most of their money, so they wouldn't be taxed under a new income tax structure in our state.
They wouldn't be taxed at all? No.
Well, for people who have already made their money and paid taxes in the state, that money wouldn't be taxed again. It's only for people who are earning new money in this state.
Bill, that's ridiculous. I mean, my son will pay a huge, huge income tax.
He will?
Come on, he's the richest man in the country. How can anybody think he isn't going to pay a huge income tax?
What is the income?
What does a person with $50 billion have for income?
It's on...
This conversation isn't making any sense.
Well, Bill Gates would pay multi-millions in taxes on the income from his investments. He wants to. He's told you that. He's for this.
Wants to is a little strong.
He's for this.
He is for it. He's very willing.
But as David Stockman will tell you, that attitude is hard to find.
We've demonized taxes, all right? We've created almost the idea that they're a metaphysical evil.
Still, he says there should be a one-time 15% surtax on the wealthy that he estimates would cut the national debt in half.
In 1985, the top 5% of the households, the wealthiest 5%, had net worth of $8 trillion, which is a lot. Today, after serial bubble after serial bubble, the top 5% have net worth of $40 trillion.
Oh my God.
And top 5% have gained more wealth than the whole human race had created prior to 1980.
Of course, it would never pass. There's the rub.
There's the rub.
The antipathy to raising taxes or making any real spending cuts, whether in Washington, D.C. or Washington State, is so intense, Stockman despairs that when Congress returns after the election, they'll do what they often do, nothing. I remember that great expression, let's kick the can down the road.
Yes.
That became kind of the mantra.
Yeah, and it still is today.
Just kick it down the road.
We're kicking the can down the
tomorrow.
road, except it's no longer a can. It's a giant junkyard.
Our government is in knots over ways to lower the federal budget deficit. Well, what if we told you we found a pot of money, over $60 billion a year, that could be used to help out? That bundle is tax money not coming into the IRS from American corporations. One major way they avoid paying the tax man is by parking their profits overseas. They'll tell you they're forced to do that because a 35% corporate tax rate is high in relation to other countries. And indeed, it seems the tax code actually encourages companies to move businesses out of the country. Companies searching out tax havens is nothing new. In the 80s and 90s, there was an exodus to Bermuda and the Cayman Islands, where there were no taxes at all. When President Obama threatened to clamp down on tax dodging, many companies decided to leave the Caribbean. But instead of coming back home, they went to safer havens like Switzerland. Several of these companies came to this tiny dot on the Swiss map called Zug, a small, quaint, medieval town. I don't think anybody's ever heard of Zug in the United States. Hans Marti, who heads Zug's Economic Development Office, showed off the nearby snow-covered mountains. But Zug's main selling point isn't a view of the Alps. How low are the taxes here?
It's something between 15 and 16%.
And in the United States, it's 35%.
I know. It's half price.
And do you have the lowest tax rate in Switzerland?
Most probably, yes.
Most probably, yes. So you're kind of a tax haven within a tax haven.
Maybe, yes.
Yeah. The population of the town of Zug is 26,000. The number of companies in the area, 30,000 and growing at an average rate of 800 a year, but many are no more than mailboxes. Texas Democratic Congressman Lloyd Doggett questions whether the recent moves of several companies are legit.
A good example is one of my Texas companies that's been in the news lately, Transocean.
Transocean owned the drilling rig involved in the giant BP oil spill. They moved to Zug 2 years ago.
I'm not sure they even moved that much. They have about 1,300 employees still in the Houston area. Mm-hmm. They have 12 or 13 in Switzerland.
And yet they claim that they're headquartered over there.
They claim they're Swiss. And they claim they're Swiss for tax purposes. And by doing that, by renouncing their American citizenship, they've saved about $2 billion in taxes.
So here we are in Zug. We went to find their operations here. And we came to see your international headquarters.
The moment my boss is not here, so...
She said her boss wasn't there, and we should call someone halfway around the world. In Houston?
Yeah.
Not here?
No.
But this is the headquarters.
I know.
And is the CEO here?
No.
I mean, normally here?
No.
Okay. Right. Another Texas company that moved here is Weatherford, a $10 billion oil field services firm. It still has 2,800 workers in Houston, but according to official documents, they are incorporated in Zug in this small building. But there was no Weatherford on the sign outside. Finally found it, listed in this thing, Weatherford International. Here's the mailbox, but we don't know even where to go. There's no listing for the international headquarters of Weatherford. So we started knocking on doors. Hi.
Grüezi.
We're looking for Weatherford. Are they in this building?
Yes.
Here?
Just a moment, please. I have to check it.
Okay. All right. I was shown to a conference room. They said Weatherford rents for board meetings. But Weatherford's Houston office told us they never go there. So are these big companies pulling a fast one? Well, apparently not. Under both Zug and U.S. tax laws, it's perfectly legal to get the low tax rate even without a real presence here. But Congressman Doggett wants to change that. You have a proposed legislation that a company will be taxed not based on where they file some pieces of paper, but where their decision makers, their management actually resides and makes decisions.
Let them pay the same way that other Houston-based companies pay. And so if they have their management and control there, they ought to be paying here in the United States. I think it's fair.
We found that faced with the mere threat of Doggett's legislation, Transocean and Weatherford both recently packed up their top brass and shipped them to Geneva. We were told Transocean's top 10 executives live around here in the Geneva area and work on the top 2 floors of this building, everyone from the CEO to the chief financial officer to the vice president of taxes. They wouldn't talk to us on camera, and neither would Weatherford. They also moved their CEO and CFO to Geneva. And so now we're beginning to see a jobs exodus from the U.S. of top management.
We can't write a law that their lawyers can't get around. That's the whole problem here.
You're in Congress. Why did Congress write these laws that allows this to happen?
There's been a lot of arm twisting, a lot of effective lobbying here, and some really smart tax lawyers figuring out how to game the system with one shenanigan after another.
But are they shenanigans or is it the law?
I think it was a shenanigan when some of these companies felt so strongly about America that they renounced their American citizenship and began saluting a foreign flag. They exploited a provision in our tax laws and moved offshore.
Congress tried to put a stop to that with a law passed in 2004 mandating that any company that wanted to move offshore would still have to pay the 35%. But because of loopholes in the tax code, companies can substantially lower their taxes by moving chunks of their businesses to their foreign subsidiaries. I think when people hear that all these companies are moving overseas because of taxes, they think that doesn't smell right.
Yeah, the question is, does a company have a moral obligation to pay its fair share?
Swiss tax attorney Thierry Boitel.
I think many companies in the US would like to keep the jobs in the US if they could. But they also need to keep the shareholders happy. And they are in the US in a corporate tax nightmare because it's the highest tax rate in the world.
With Japan slated to lower its rate in April, the U.S. will soon have the highest corporate tax rate in the developed world.
We are dealing with a tax system that is a dinosaur.
One CEO who would talk to us is John Chambers, head of Cisco, the giant high-tech company headquartered in San Jose. He says our tax rate is insane. It's forcing companies into these maneuvers, especially when many other industrialized countries, including Canada, are busy lowering their tax rates in order to lure our companies and our jobs away.
Every other government in the world have realized that the U.S. has it wrong. They're saying, I'm going to have lower taxes, period. That's what you see across all Western Europe. That's what you see in Asia and the developed countries.
Are you judged as a CEO on things like this, on taxes?
Absolutely.
He's been expanding Cisco overseas because of growing demand abroad, but also to lower the company's taxes. Their average rate over the last 3 years, just 20%. Economist Martin Sullivan says it's standard operating procedure for companies like Cisco.
U.S. multinationals are shifting their research facilities, shifting their manufacturing facilities, and shifting some regional headquarters into Switzerland and into Ireland. And those are massive numbers of jobs.
He says Ireland taxes corporations at just a third of the U.S. rate. So no wonder the outskirts of Dublin look like Silicon Valley. These companies are all but obliged to go abroad.
Well, if you have a 35% rate in the United States and, for example, a 12.5% rate in Ireland, there's an incentive to move your factory to Ireland.
600 American companies are in Ireland, and they employ 100,000 people.
That's right.
Those are jobs that aren't here. And they moved to Ireland because of taxes.
The U.S. Treasury, in effect, is subsidizing investment in Ireland.
Why isn't everybody in Ireland?
Well, almost everybody is in Ireland. All the pharmaceutical companies, all the high-tech companies. You're stupid if you're not in Ireland.
We noticed that you have an awful lot of companies in Ireland.
Yes, we do.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 companies in Ireland.
We do what makes sense to the shareholders. We go where there are incentives in countries that say, we want you here, we're going to give you tax advantages, we want you to add jobs here, etc. We can no longer in America say, this is how we do it, therefore you must do it. We've got to change or we're going to get left behind.
An increasingly popular way, particularly pharmaceutical and high-tech companies like Google avoid paying the 35%, is to shift their patents, computer code, pill formulas, even logos from their U.S. bases to their outposts in low-tax countries.
100 years ago, if a company would want to relocate, you'd have to pick up a factory, machinery, move everything.
Yeah.
Today, a company can move predominantly all of its assets just on paper.
You can push a button and move your algorithms.
Or Coca-Cola could take the recipe out of the vault and put it in a Swiss vault.
Yeah. And then it's Swiss.
Yeah.
When a formula or a computer code is registered abroad, say in Zug, a U.S. company is allowed to claim that a lot of its taxable profits are there, even if most of its sales are in the U.S.
The need for tax reform is greater than ever.
Economist Sullivan told Congress these patents and profit transfers are accounting tricks that allowed companies to chip away at the 35% and save tens of billions of dollars. He says that from 2007 to 2009, these maneuvers helped lower Pfizer's average tax rate to 17%, Merck to 12.5%, and GE just 3.6%.
You know, what's really remarkable as I review the data is the consistency with which you see this phenomenon. The taxes are going down The profits are shifting offshore at an accelerated rate over the last few years.
So now these companies have profits accumulating overseas in places like Zug.
Oh, look at your clock tower.
If they bring the money home, it's taxed at the full 35%. If they leave it overseas, the IRS can't touch it. In other words, the tax law all but forces companies to keep their money out of the country indefinitely.
We leave the money over there, I create jobs overseas, I acquire companies overseas, I build plants overseas, and I badly want to bring that money back.
How much does your company have overseas that could be brought back
Almost
here?
$40 billion. $40 billion.
Cisco has $40 billion trapped over there somewhere.
Yes.
The total amount of money U.S. companies have trapped overseas is $1.2 trillion. Chambers is advocating for a one-time tax break to allow them to bring that money home at a rate of, say, 5%. He says that would stimulate the economy and create jobs.
What is your downside for money that isn't going to come back anyhow? I'd say your downside is zero.
But the Obama administration opposes this idea. When it was tried in 2005, the Treasury did rake in billions of dollars, though very few jobs were created. What if tomorrow Congress passed a quickie law and the tax rate was 20%? Would that solve everything?
I think it is the most important ingredient that we have to think about being competitive.
You lower the rate from 35% to 20%. You lose something like $2 trillion in taxes. We have a horrible deficit crisis, debt crisis. That's almost too much money to lose. What's your answer to that?
My answer is very simply, every other developed country in the world has already done this. I'm not asking you to give me a favor or a handout.
You know what? It sounds it.
All we're asking is give us a level playing field. Get us close.
The next national election is now less than a year away, and congressmen and senators are expending much of their time and their energy raising the millions of dollars in campaign funds they'll need just to hold on to a job that pays $174,000 a year. Few of them are doing it for the salary, and all of them will say they're doing it to serve the public. But there are other benefits: power, prestige, and the opportunity to become a Washington insider with access to information and connections that no one else has in an environment of privilege where rules that govern the rest of the country don't always apply to them. Most former congressmen and senators manage to leave Washington, if they ever leave Washington, with more money in their pockets than they had when they arrived. And as you are about to see, the biggest challenge is often avoiding temptation.
This is a venture opportunity. This is an opportunity to leverage your position in public service and use that position to enrich yourself, your friends, and your family.
Peter Schweizer is a fellow at the Hoover Institution, a conservative think tank at Stanford University. A year ago, he began working on a book about soft corruption in Washington with a team of 8 student researchers who reviewed financial disclosure records. The results became a jumping-off point for our own story, and we have independently verified the material we've used. Schweizer says he wanted to know why some congressmen and senators managed to accumulate significant wealth beyond their salaries and proved particularly adept at buying and selling stocks.
There are all sorts of forms of honest grafts that congressmen engage in that allow them to become very, very wealthy. So it's not illegal, but I think it's highly unethical. I think it's highly offensive and wrong.
What do you mean honest graft?
For example, insider trading on the stock market. If you are a member of Congress, those laws are deemed not to apply.
So congressmen get a pass on insider trading?
They do. The fact is, if you sit on a healthcare committee and you know that Medicare, for example, is considering not reimbursing for a certain drug, that's market-moving information. And if you can trade stock off of that information and do so legally, that's a great profit-making opportunity, and that sort of behavior goes on.
Why does Congress get a pass on this?
It's really the way the rules have been defined, and the people who make the rules are the political class in Washington, and they've conveniently written them in such a way that they don't apply to themselves.
The buying and selling of stock by corporate insiders who have access to non-public information that could affect the stock price can be a criminal offense. Just ask hedge fund manager Roger Ratnam, who recently got 11 years in prison for doing it. But congressional lawmakers have no corporate responsibilities and have long been considered exempt from insider trading laws, even though they have daily access to non-public information and plenty of opportunities to trade on it.
We know that during the healthcare debate, people were trading healthcare stocks. We know that during the financial crisis of 2008, they were getting out of the market before the rest of America really knew what was going on.
In mid-September 2008, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average still above 10,000, Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson and Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke were holding closed-door briefings with congressional leaders and privately warning them that a global financial meltdown could occur within a few days. One of those attending was Alabama Representative Spencer Backus, then the ranking Republican member on the House Financial Services Committee, and now its chairman.
These meetings were so sensitive that they would actually confiscate cell phones and BlackBerries going into those meetings. What we know is that those meetings were held one day, and literally the next day, Congressman Backus would engage in buying stock options based on apocalyptic briefings that he had had the day before from the Fed chairman and the Treasury Secretary. I mean, talk about a stock tip.
While Congressman Backus was publicly trying to keep the economy from cratering, he was privately betting that it would, buying option funds that would go up in value if the market went down. He would make a variety of trades and profit at a time when most Americans were losing their shirts. Congressman Backus declined to talk to us, so we went to his office and ran into his press secretary, Tim Johnson.
We're not alleging that Congressman Backus has violated any laws.
Okay.
The only thing we're interested in talking to him is about his, about his trades.
Okay, that's a fair enough request.
What we got was a statement from Congressman Backus's office that he never trades on non-public information or financial services stock. However, his financial disclosure form seemed to indicate otherwise. Backus made money trading General Electric stock during the crisis, and a third of GE's business is in financial services. During the health care debate of 2009, members of Congress were trading health care stocks, including House Minority Leader John Boehner, who led the opposition against the so-called public option, government-funded insurance that would compete with private companies. Just days before the provision was finally killed off, Boehner bought health insurance stocks, all of which went up. Now Speaker of the House, Congressman Boehner also declined to be interviewed, so we tracked him down at his weekly press conference.
Speaker Boehner, you made a number of trades going back to the health care debate. You bought some insurance stock. Did you make those trades based on non-public information?
I have not made any decisions on day-to-day trading activities in my account and haven't for years. I do not do it, haven't done it, and wouldn't do it.
Later, Boehner's spokesman told us that the healthcare trades were made by the Speaker's financial advisor, who he only consults with about once a year.
We need to find out whether they're part of a blind trust or not.
Peter Schweitzer thinks the timing is suspicious and believes congressional leaders should have their stock funds in blind trusts.
Whether it's $15,000 or $150,000, the principle in my mind is that it's simply wrong and it shouldn't take place.
But there is a long history of self-dealing in Washington, and it doesn't always involve stock trades.
Congressmen and senators also seem to have a special knack for land and real estate deals. When Illinois Congressman Dennis Hastert became Speaker of the House in 1999, he was worth a few $100,000. He left the job 8 years later, a multimillionaire.
The road that Hastert wants to build will go through these farm fields right here.
In 2005, Speaker Hastert got a $207 million federal earmark to build the Prairie Parkway through these cornfields near his home. What Jan Strasma and his neighbors didn't know was that Hastert had also bought some land adjacent to where the highway is supposed to go.
5 months after this earmark went through, he sold that land and made a bundle of money.
How much?
$2 million.
What do you think of it?
It stinks.
We stopped by the former Speaker's farm to ask him about the land deal, but he was off in Washington, where he now works as a lobbyist. His office told us that property values in the area began to appreciate even before the earmark, and that the Hastert land was several miles from the nearest exit. But the same good fortune befell former New Hampshire Senator Judd Gregg, who helped steer nearly $70 million in government funds towards redeveloping this defunct Air Force base, which she and his brother both had a commercial interest in. Greg has said that he violated no congressional rules.
It's but one more example of good things happening to powerful members of Congress. Another is the access to initial public stock offerings, the opportunity to buy a new stock at insider prices just as it goes on the market. They can be incredibly lucrative and hard to get.
If you were a senator, Steve, and I gave you $10,000 cash, one or both of us is probably going to go to jail. But if I'm a corporate executive and you're a senator, and I give you IPO shares in stock, and over the course of one day, that stock nets you $100,000, that's completely legal.
And former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and her husband had participated in at least 8 IPOs. One of those came in 2008 from Visa, just as a troublesome piece of legislation that would have hurt credit card companies began making its way through the House. Undisturbed by a potential conflict of interest, the Pelosi's purchased 5,000 shares of Visa at the initial price of $44. 2 days later, it was trading at $64. The credit card legislation never made it to the floor of the House. Congresswoman Pelosi also declined our request for an interview, but agreed to call on us if we attended a news conference.
Madam Leader, I wanted to ask you why you and your husband, back in March of 2008, accepted and participated in a very large IPO deal from Visa. At a time there was major legislation affecting the credit card companies making its way through the House. And did you consider that to be a conflict of interest?
I don't know what your point is of your question. Is there some point that you want to make with that?
Well, I guess what I'm asking is, do you think it's all right for a speaker to accept a very preferential and favorable stock deal?
Well, we didn't.
You participated in the IPO.
Well, I have many
and at the time you were
investments, but
Speaker of the House. You don't think it was a conflict of interest or had the appearance of a conflict of interest?
It only has the appearance if you decide that you're going to have elaborate on a false premise. But it's not true, and that's that.
I don't understand what part's not true.
Yes, sir. That I would act upon an investment. Yes, sir.
Congresswoman Pelosi pointed out that the tough credit card legislation eventually passed, but it was 2 years later and was initiated in the Senate.
I will hold my record in terms of fighting the credit card companies as a Speaker of the House or as a member of Congress up against anyone's.
Corporate executives, members of the executive branch, and all federal judges are subject to strict conflict of interest rules, but not the people who write the laws.
If you are a member of Congress and you sit on the Defense Committee, you are free to trade defense stock as much as you want to. If you're on the Senate Banking Committee, you can trade bank stock as much as you want, and that regularly goes on in all these committees.
There should only be one thing in your mind when you're drafting legislation. Is this good for the United States of America? That's it. If you're starting to say to yourself, how's this going to affect my investments? You've got a mixed agenda and a mixed purpose for being there. And
Brian Baird is a former congressman from Washington State who served 6 terms in the House before retiring last year. He spent half of those 12 years trying to get his colleagues to prohibit insider trading in Congress and establish some rules governing conflicts of interest.
one line in a bill in Congress can be worth millions and millions of dollars. I mean, there was one night we had a late night caucus, and you could kind of tell how a vote was going to go the next day. And I literally walked home and I thought, man, if you went online and made some significant trades, you could make a lot of money on this. You could just see it. You could see the potential here.
So in 2004, Baird and Congresswoman Louise Slaughter introduced the Stock Act, which would make it illegal for members of Congress to trade stocks on non-public information and require them to report their stock trades every 90 days instead of once a year.
How far did you get with this?
We didn't get anywhere. Just flat died. Went nowhere.
How many co-sponsors did you get?
I think we got 6.
6 doesn't sound like a very big amount.
It's not, Steve. You could have National Cherry Pie Week and get 100 co-sponsors. I mean,
when Baird finally managed to get a congressional hearing on the Stock Act, almost no one showed up. It's reintroduced every session, but is buried so deep in the Capitol, we had trouble finding congressmen who had ever heard of it.
Have you ever heard of the Stock Act? The what? The Stock Act. Do you know anything about it?
No.
Congressman? Congressman?
I haven't heard about that one yet.
Have you ever heard of something called the Stock Act?
No.
I've heard about it, but I can't say it's an issue I spent a lot of time on, though.
I would have no problem with that.
Okay.
But then again, I am a big fan of, instant disclosure on almost everything.
They're looking for co-sponsors.
And yet, I've never heard of it.
When you have a bill like this that makes so much sense, and you can't get the co-sponsorships, you can't get the leadership to move it, it gets tremendously frustrating. Set aside that it's the right thing to do, it's good politics. People want their Congress to function well. It still baffles me.
But what baffles Baird even more is that the situation has gotten worse. In the past few years, a whole new totally unregulated $100 million industry has grown up in Washington called political intelligence. It employs former congressmen and former staffers to scour the halls of the Capitol, gathering valuable non-public information, then selling it to hedge funds and traders on Wall Street who can trade on it.
Now, if you're a political intel guy and you get that information long before it's public, long before somebody wakes up the next morning and reads or watches the television or whatever, you've got it. And you can make real-time trades before anybody else.
Baird says it's taken what would be a criminal enterprise anyplace else in the country and turned it into a profitable business model.
The town is all about people saying, what do you know that I don't know? And this is the currency of Washington, D.C. And it's that kind of informational currency that translates into real currency. Maybe it's over drinks. Maybe somebody picks up a phone and says, just to let you know, it's in the bill. Trades happen. Can't trace them. If you can trace them, it's not illegal. It's a pretty great system. You feel like an idiot to not take advantage of it.
The American public has a low opinion of Congress. Only 14% think it's doing a good job. But Congress has excelled in one way, raising money. Members of Congress raised more than $1 billion for their 2014 election, and they never stop. Nearly every day, they spend hours on the phone asking supporters and even total strangers for campaign donations, hours spent away from the jobs they were elected to do. The pressure on candidates to raise money has ratcheted up since the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision in 2010. That allowed unlimited spending by corporations, unions, and individuals in elections. So our attention was caught by a proposal from a Republican congressman that would stop members of Congress from dialing for dollars. Given what it costs to get elected today, it's either a courageous act, a campaign ploy, or political suicide.
Tonight is not about claiming victory. Tonight is about committing to service.
Florida Republican David Jolly won a special election to Congress in March 2014. Facing a re-election bid that November, he was happy to get a lesson in fundraising from a member of his party's leadership. But he was surprised by what he learned.
We sat behind closed doors at one of the party headquarters back rooms in front of a whiteboard where the equation was drawn out. You have 6 months until the election. Break that down to having to raise $2 million in the next 6 months, and your job, you member of Congress, is to raise $18,000 a day. Your first responsibility is to make sure you hit $18,000 a day.
Your first responsibility,
My first responsibility
as a congressman.
As a sitting member of Congress.
How are you supposed to raise $18,000 a day?
Simply by calling people, cold calling a list that fundraisers put in front of you. You're presented with their biography. So please call John. He's married to Sally. His daughter Emma just graduated from high school. They gave $18,000 last year to different candidates. They can give you $1,000 too if you ask them to. And they put you on the phone. And it's a script.
There are actually scripts for calls. and we got our hands on one distributed by the National Republican Congressional Committee to help GOP members invite donors to attend their annual fundraising dinner in March. It has this useful diagram. If the donor answers the phone, the caller should plug the unique opportunity to come together with House Republican leadership. If they get turned down, they should remind the donor that the NRCC did a great deal to help maintain the majority in 2014. And if they get a yes, there's even an instruction for the caller to pause and let the donor speak. It must have worked. That NRCC dinner raised more than $20 million, breaking records. It was attended by members of Congress, major donors, and lobbyists, including this man who was not too happy to see our camera crew. But one successful fundraiser does not let Congress members off the hook. The phone calls asking for money never stop.
The House schedule is actually arranged in some ways around fundraising.
You're telling me the whole schedule of how work gets done is scheduled around fundraising?
That's right. You never see a committee working through lunch because those are your fundraising times. And then in between afternoon votes and evening votes, that's when you can see Democrats walking down this street, Republicans walking down that street to spend time on the phone making phone calls.
By law, members of Congress cannot make fundraising calls from their offices. So both parties have set up call centers just a few blocks away. This is where the Republicans have theirs. So can I go in there?
I don't think they would let either one of us in here at this point. Remember, I stopped paying my dues.
What Jolly means is that in addition to raising money for their own campaigns, members are supposed to raise thousands of dollars for their parties. That's their dues. If Republican members don't pay up, they can't use the party's call suites. No photos exist of the inside of either the Democratic or Republican centers. But with the help of a staffer, we were able to get into the Republican center with a hidden camera. About a dozen tiny offices, equipped with a phone and computer, line a corridor. This is where members of Congress sit behind closed doors and plow through lists of donors, dialing for dollars. Outside in the main hallway is a big board where the amount each member has raised for the party is posted for all to see and compare.
It is a cult-like boiler room on Capitol Hill where sitting members of Congress, frankly, I believe, are compromising the dignity of the office they hold by sitting in these sweatshop phone booths calling people, asking them for money. And their only goal is to get $500 or $1,000 or $2,000 out of the person on the other end of the line. It's shameful. It's beneath the dignity of the office that our voters and our communities entrust us to serve.
But you may not have a job if you don't fundraise.
I'm willing to take that risk.
A risk because David Jolly has pledged to stop personally asking donors for money. And that's not all. In February, he introduced a bill called the STOP Act that would ban all federal elected officials from directly soliciting donations. But Congressman, with all due respect, stopping members of Congress from making phone calls is not going to fix the entire system.
Certainly not.
It's not comprehensive campaign finance reform.
It is not. This is congressional reform. It very simply says members of Congress spend too much time raising money and not enough time doing their job. Get back to work and do your job.
The STOP Act would still allow members of Congress to attend fundraisers. Others could still ask for donations on their behalf. Republican Congressman Reed Ribble has signed on as a co-sponsor of the STOP Act. After 6 years in Washington, he's going home to Wisconsin at the end of this term. You've spent your life running a commercial roofing company.
Yeah.
And when you came to Congress and heard how much you have to raise to keep getting reelected, did you want to quit?
Yeah, I did.
Are you the only one who feels that way?
No. If members would be candid, there's a lot of frustration centered around it. And some of this is the result of Citizens United, the Supreme Court decision that opened up really corporate dollars into the system. And so if you want to have your own voice, if you want your voice to be heard as opposed to some outside group speaking for you, you better do your job and raise enough money that you can.
After the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision, a flood of outside money poured into super PACs, political groups which are allowed to spend unlimited dollars on ads to support or attack candidates for office.
The last few years of Congress have been the most unproductive ever.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. I didn't hardly recognize the place when I came back.
Congressman Rick Nolan, a Democrat from Minnesota, is also co-sponsoring the STOP Act. Nolan was first elected to Congress in 1974, but served just 6 years. He returned in 2013.
It seems like I took a nap and I came back and I said, wow, what happened to this place? What's happened to democracy? I mean, the Congress of the United States has hardly become a democratic institution anymore.
Why?
Well, because of all the money in politics, in my judgment.
What has your party said about how members of Congress should raise money?
Well, both parties have told newly elected members of the Congress that they should spend 30 hours a week in the Republican and Democratic call centers across the street from the Congress, dialing for dollars.
30 hours a week?
30 hours is what they tell you should spend. And it's discouraging good people from running for public office. I could give you names of people who said, you know, I'd like to go to Washington and help fix problems, but I don't want to go to Washington and become a mid-level telemarketer dialing for dollars, for crying out loud.
You're saying members of Congress are becoming like telemarketers?
Well, 30 hours a week, that's a lot of telemarketing, probably more than most telemarketers do.
The Republican House Campaign Committee would not tell us whether it recommends a specific amount of call time. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee claims it currently does not. But in 2013, at an orientation meeting, new Democratic members were shown a model schedule. It was later published by the Huffington Post. It suggested representatives should spend 4 hours a day on call time and just 2 hours a day on the business of Congress, committee meetings, and time on the House floor. The man in charge of the Democratic Campaign Committee at the time was Congressman Steve Israel, a Democrat from New York.
That's more time calling and asking for money than constituent work or floor work in Congress.
Very frustrating.
That's what your message
yes.
was, though, to other lawmakers. Spend more time raising money than working on your constituents' needs or being on the floor of the Congress.
Very frustrating. The result of a system that is broken, the result of a system that allows unlimited amounts of money to be spent against you.
Before Citizens United, about how many hours a day would you have to spend on the phone raising money?
I have to put in about an hour, maybe an hour and a half, at most 2 hours a day into fundraising. And that's the way it went until 2010, when Citizens United was enacted. At that point, everything changed, and I had to increase that to 2, 3, sometimes 4 hours a day, depending on what was happening in the schedule.
Israel revealed he spent more than 4,000 hours on the phone soliciting donations. It's something he won't miss when he leaves Congress at the end of this term. Still, he doesn't support the STOP Act.
Do you applaud Congressman Jolly for at least trying to do something on this issue?
Look, I'm glad that Congressman Jolly is focusing attention on the issue. I'd rather focus solutions on the issue. And if I believe that his bill was really going to be meaningful, was going to take money out of politics, I'd support it in a second. But it really doesn't. If you ask me on a to make an assessment as to the prospects of passage, 1 being the president should get ready to sign it, and 5 being it's dead on arrival, I'd put it at a 15. It's not going to pass.
I urge you, while you are here, before retiring and lamenting the amount of time you spent raising money, co-sponsor the STOP Act.
Despite Jolly's repeated pleas on the House floor to his colleagues, only 6 are supporting his bill.
Why do you just have a handful of supporters for this act?
I think people are scared to death of their own re-election. There's a lot of people who will see me coming and break eye contact. They don't want to talk about it.
Isn't this just a convenient way for you to campaign as an outsider?
Is it politically appealing? Yes. But that doesn't make it wrong.
Jolly is now running for the Florida Senate seat, being vacated by Marco Rubio. It's a race that could determine whether Republicans hold on to control of the Senate. We caught up with Jolly at a Blue Jays spring training game in his Florida district.
How much is it going to cost to win the Senate seat?
Boy, some say $100 million statewide.
$100 million?
That's right.
So how can you raise that money if you're not going to make any phone calls?
We have a robust campaign team that can make phone calls, that can organize events, that can raise as many resources as we can possibly raise as a campaign team.
At the moment, Jolly's leading most polls against his Republican primary opponents, but he's lagging in fundraising. And that makes his pledge to stop asking for donations look like quite a gamble.
So what happens if you have not raised enough money and it's the last week of the campaign and a super PAC dumps in millions of dollars that might be distorting your record?
At the end of the day, if you tell me that the only way to be a United States Senator is to raise $100 million in Florida, then I'm not the next United States Senator from the state of Florida. And that's okay. It's a shame for the system, but it's fine for me.